accepting that fact that like, yeah, I can do both and it's great and it works a lot better.
All right, welcome back to the podcast. I am super excited to have Courtney Edgecomb on today. Courtney is a physical therapist in Connecticut, and we got connected because she took our R2R Pro course in its first cohort. I guess it was a year ago, a little over a year ago. And so I've gotten to know Courtney a little bit, and I just want to invite her on to share a little bit about what her experience has been as a pelvic PT, but then also now starting to work with more runners. So Courtney, welcome to the show. If you don't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself and your practice and all that good stuff.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me on. So my name is Courtney. I'm a pelvic floor physical therapist in Connecticut. I'm in Hamden, which is actually just short north of New Haven. So where Yale is, if a person doesn't know what New Haven is. But yeah, I have my own practice here called Regenerative Edge Physical Therapy with my husband, actually. He does kind of orthopedic and sports PT.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's super fun. So we've been in our practice together for a little over a year, and we are growing and just finding out the new ways to fit into the community. And there is a big need here for prenatal and postpartum care. So that has been a big shift into where we have made our presence, which has been super fun. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Very cool. So for you, like what made you even think about wanting to work with postpartum runners?
Sure, yeah. So I used to be a runner, and I say used to because I did like half marathons and I did a marathon and like that. Running was my thing. I still do some running, but I don't really consider myself much of a runner because I will go out for the casual run, but it's not really my main source of exercise. I've kind of shifted to like weight training and CrossFit style things.
All good stuff.
Yeah, just feeling my body at the stage where I am.
Yeah.
But I still love running, so it's a passion of mine. I think it's great, and again, for a period of my life, it was absolute joy, and still is when I go out for the casual run now. And so that's kind of my personal level with running. But I also am just an active person, and I really love helping people. Even since I started getting into physical therapy from a younger age, going myself, but also as I was going through school, going through different rotations, and then kind of starting out as a new grad, really love the active side of it and pulling in that, side of care, especially in pelvic health. Because a lot of times, pelvic health has a range of things that we can treat. And sometimes I feel like there's a little bit of a missing part in bringing in the active part of prenatal, postpartum, pelvic health care. So anyways, that's kind of how those two things combine together.
Gotcha. And then for you, how did you find your way into pelvic health? I always find that there's always an interesting story there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was in an orthopedic practice, and I was really honestly just kind of looking for con ed courses to take. And I'd heard a little buzz about pelvic floor at the time. This was probably like 5 years ago. And anyway, I just kind of decided to go off on a whim and take this course. It sounded very interesting to me. And so I went, did that, 3-day Herman Wallace sort of course. I went with a colleague of mine, and I absolutely loved it, like from the very first day.
That's awesome.
And it really resonated with me as well. Like I've had a little bit of my own difficulties with like urgency, constipation, that side of thing. And so it was like, wow, like you can do physical therapy for this. This is so cool.
Right.
And then it just kind of evolved from there. And I ended up switching from the orthopedic practice I was at to kind of a purely pelvic health physical therapy center, and was there for a couple of years and learned a ton and had really great mentorship. And here I am.
That's awesome. Yeah, I totally resonate with voices that you have a combo, you have a mashup. I'm not a good Kool-Aid drinker. I'm not good with one thing, as you well know. But like, no, I don't know how people treat pelvic health without having orthopedic background or without having some other background. And especially, like you said, activity, running, lifting, all of those things, if you don't understand the basics behind it, I feel like there's just like a whole facet of that that you miss because
Right.
it really just isn't in this one tiny little place. And the longer I practice, the more I realize I'm like, oh my gosh, it's all the things, which
Yeah.
probably when you're new is a little overwhelming, but
Yeah, and you gotta focus on one thing at a time to really kind of learn and get
yeah,
the groove down, and the groove's always changing still. But yeah, I totally agree. It's like we've got to really combine both worlds,
yes,
and go from it at very different angles and
yeah.
not just like only one lens at the pelvic floor.
Exactly. And how lucky does your husband do orthopedics as well, or
Yes. Yep.
oh, how lucky is he that he can just be like, "Hey, we've got a pelvic floor issue. My lovely wife here can
Yeah.
handle that." But lucky for you too. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of my orthopedics, if it's basic stuff,
Got
I'll
it. Great.
handle it. If it's
Yeah.
something that's going to be like really like a specific rehab or something, I'll refer out to
Right.
colleagues of mine. But nice that you can keep it in-house. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. It's awesome. It's fantastic. It works
That's
really
one
well.
of the benefits of marrying a PT, right?
Yeah. One of them. Yes.
There's only one.
Yeah, that is the only one.
Right? I got the IT guy. Basically, what I know
Well,
there
that's
is I need
helpful
to be
too.
able to reboot things and start everything over before I ask for help. So, so for you, like, when you started working with postpartum runners, you have this orthopedic background, you understand running as an
Mhm,
individual, you understand it as an orthopedic PT.
mhm.
What were kind of the challenges that you were running into trying to kind of mash all this up with your pelvic health knowledge and your running knowledge and your orthopedic knowledge? What were the challenges that you were running into?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think that just that it was like, how do I mash this at first?
Yeah.
Because when I was first learning everything about pelvic floor and pelvic health, it was like, okay, now where do I draw and everything, and how do I have the time to do that? What do I
Right.
prioritize? Like, what's important here? And so I think that honestly was one of the biggest challenges of like, okay, but I've got to look at their pelvic floor. So how do I also look at their like hip strength and their balance and their lumbar spine? And how do
Right.
I find the way to do that in a methodical way that doesn't feel like, especially to the patient, that I'm all over the place.
Yep.
I think that was a really big challenge for me. And also, I think honestly, just being comfortable with the fact of it's okay for me to mash these things together and to
Yes.
be just a pelvic floor physical therapist.
Yes.
And just accepting that fact that like, yeah, I can do both, and it's great, and it works a lot better. Those were two of the things for me. That was just finding my way into that
Yep.
versus like just being like, okay, I have this one thing and the other thing, and where do they connect?
Right. Right. And I think when you do take those basic level courses, there's no integration. It's
Right.
just basic, like this is,
Yeah, it's like
things
here's
I
an internal exam.
Yep.
Great, bye.
There's
Yeah,
no problem solving, there's no integration,
yeah,
there's no how do you take this and apply this to a high level athlete? So you kind of are left kind of holding these two buckets.
yeah.
For you, was that because I know for me, no one, I mean, obviously was doing that. And for me, you know, I literally was treating these two populations separately.
Mm.
And then one day I was like, they go together. And it
Yeah.
was just the dumbest thing. I was like, well, why can't I? I mean, for you, was it this question of how do I or can I? And do I need to ask permission? Or like what was that kind of thought process for you?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit more of how do I, not
Okay.
necessarily like, am I allowed to? It was more of just like how, because again, at the time I was so immersed in like, okay, I've got to do this pelvic floor exam. I've got to look at their motor control. I've got to, see is there tightness, is there not? And like,
Yep.
and the practice where I started off at was very hands-on, like manual therapy as well. So I think I felt a little bit of pressure that I had to do manual therapy, and that if I wasn't quite like doing what I should be doing. I don't know. So
Right.
again, it wasn't necessarily that I wasn't allowed to do that. I just maybe didn't feel comfortable. And so then it was kind of like over time getting used to the fact of like, okay, I feel more comfortable also with my own pelvic floor skills. Now I
Right.
can figure that out in a better timeline and also put in some of the orthopedic stuff. And then I started to have more people as well who were Okay, I have this lower back pain, I have this hip pain, I have this orthopedic issue, I've had
Right.
this ankle injury in the past, and even shoulder and neck stuff. And so then it was like, okay, like these pieces are starting to come together a little bit more, especially from a clinical perspective. Now I feel more comfortable with it, and the flow came together a little bit better, and the prioritization of like, okay, I have 60 minutes to do this with somebody, but I don't have to do everything in that 60 minutes. I can do it in the next session too. So it's kind of a matter of like, all right, what's the best bang for my buck out of this session to get us to the next place? And learning that was really just kind of a progression.
No, I love hearing that, because it kind of makes me reflect on, when I started to do a mashup, it honestly for me was more permission, because no one was doing it.
Sure.
Not to age myself, but like it just wasn't a thing.
Right.
And then there were very few of us. And then I think we started to find each other a little bit. And then you start to have like the things that I learned the most were from colleagues that were in sports and orthopedics that were interested in what I had to say, and felt like instead of me plugging a hole, we were kind of doing it for each other. Like we were filling in gaps for each other. And, I learned so much hip stuff from some great colleagues, which obviously if you're treating pelvic floor, that's incredibly important. But again, I think then it was literally nobody was doing it. So it's actually really kind of comforting in a weird way to be like, it wasn't a matter of, can I do it? It's how do I do that? Because the tools that I've been given have been very piecemeal. How do I kind of pull this together?
Exactly.
So maybe that's a good caveat, like share your experience a little bit with R2R Pro and kind of what you were able to sort of take from it. And then we can kind of chat about like any case scenarios or things like that where you're able to apply it.
Totally. So R2R Pro was amazing. And I think one of the biggest things that I really loved from your course, especially, was the critical thinking piece that went into it.
It's my fave.
So many courses you're just put through the lecture and then you're told, okay, this is how you do the manipulation or whatever. And then this is how, here's a case study. Good luck. Whereas your course was very much like, what are your own limitations? What are your fallbacks? Like, what do you need to progress in? What do you feel like are the barriers, And I really had never been asked that question before. And then having that in every module that we went through, right? And kind of putting it very specifically and applying it was so important to really just like, oh man, like, okay, that really was what I was struggling with. I can put it down on paper and then I can actually realize this is where I need to make the change versus just listening to all these things and being like, great, cool. It's another thing I can use,
Right.
And so, I mean, literally like the next day I was able to use things and it was awesome,
that's so cool to hear.
And it was kind of like we were talking about like this, ortho pelvic health mashup. It again was one of those scenarios where it was like, this is how the pieces come together, right? And this is how you can still look at pelvic floor symptoms, things going on, but put it into that orthopedic lens at the same time. And that was huge for me. And even just like the screening process, which was like, think about it as like, okay, I learned some of that stuff like with school and orthopedics and that sort of stuff. It was like, okay, it's not like I've never seen it before, but for me to put it then in the perspective of this is orthopedics and pelvic health, and we're applying it to the symptoms and the, expectations and the goals of what somebody is going through, was just like light bulbs going off. And it was so easy for me to put into practice. Like, it's just such a regular thing for me now. And again, like we were talking about earlier, is like, okay, well, how do I have the time to do all of that? Sometimes I don't get to that screening on the first time. It might be like the third or fourth, and it might depend on the person. Like, they might not be really feeling that comfortable to do it the first time. And that's the first time I see them. And that's fine. So, okay, great. We're going to do it either the next time. Maybe we'll do half of it next time. We'll do half of it the next time. Like, let's just focus on also, what's their story? What am I listening to that is telling me like, maybe their balance is off, or maybe their impact is off. Let's look at that first. And then, kind of go from there. So it really was just that like critical thinking piece was totally different in a good way.
That's so great to hear. And I feel like, and again, I graduated a while ago, but like, I feel like that piece was never overtly put forward in education. And then when you take your continuing education, it's kind of like, here, learn these facts. And then we're like, okay, well, you're a doctoring profession now. And I'm like, but I'm treating like a technician.
Right.
And I think it was a colleague of mine, trained in Australia, of course, that he sports orthopedics, and we were talking about critical thinking and problem solving. And I never trusted. I'm not great with details at all. So like the minutia stuff never really
Yeah.
worked for me. Like I have this gut sense, which is weird when you tell somebody and they're like, I'm not woo, I promise you I'm not woo. But like I have a gut sense that like a general thing is going on.
Yeah.
Like, how do I put that into words? And I remember I really thought a lot of him. And one day he came up to me and he's like, Carrie, don't take this the wrong way, but I think you and I think a lot alike. And then he walked away. And I'm like, what? Like, what? I think I'm honored, but I don't know why. And when I think back, it was from that time on, it's like, how do I take this gut feeling? How do I put a framework on it? How do I put a process on it that's not so minutia driven?
Yeah.
But I realized that no one ever taught us that. Like it wasn't a thing. And again, any of the continuing education stuff, we're just like, great, we got these pieces. And I'm like, okay, now what?
Right.
I just spent a lot of money and I don't know anything. And nobody's any better.
Right. And I mean, I can't tell you how many Con Ed courses that I've been to that like years later, I'm like, oh yeah, I did take that course, but where is that material that I've been looking for? You know, like it's just, it doesn't apply in a way that I directly use, or at least it doesn't get put through that critical thinking phase where I'm like,
yeah,
this is where I need it. Yeah.
Well, and I think you bring up a great point. And, you know, for me, I think where the self-reflection piece came from was I was asking that of my clients. And I was like, all right, well, I need you to be mindful. I need you to be aware. And I'm like, wait a second. If I'm asking them, I need to ask myself where the blind spots are. Where are my blind spots? What am I missing? What are my go-tos? Just like we have our clients that have their strategies that they revert to, that their brain thinks it's awesome. And if it really were that awesome, they wouldn't be sitting there with you.
Yep.
What do we think is really like the bomb and really isn't? But we're too stuck in ourselves to see it. So that reflection, that self-reflection piece came from, oh my gosh, I'm not asking the same of myself as I am of my client. I'm like,
no, that's awesome.
Oh, but that's also mentoring 101 too. Like you ask me a question, I'm going to ask you to answer it first. That's mentoring 101. Exactly. So maybe you can share just, you know, like a typical case for you, like how do you kind of take that process now and what might you have done before and kind of how do you walk through it now? What makes it easy for you to kind of do this now?
Yeah. So I think like before, you know, let's say I had a runner who was coming to me, they were having leaking, you know, postpartum. I think my really sole way of going about that was starting with like, okay, let's look at your pelvic floor. Well, maybe there's some tightness there. Let's work on that a little bit first. Well, maybe you don't have quite the motor control. Let's, you know, sit and do some of these exercises, maybe integrate it with a little bit of, you know, different types of movements, but nothing like too crazy. And hope for the best.
Right.
And, you know, this is kind of how I started. It was, again,
but that's what we were taught.
Yeah, part of it was where I start, part of it was what I was getting comfortable with. And anyway, so that, you know, was kind of simply where I would start. Now, my, you know, biggest thing is really getting into not like fine details, but a lot more of the story. So listening to the patient a little bit more and really having them tell me and ask them questions so that they are kind of linking a little bit more of it together themselves as well.
Yeah.
Kind of like that mentoring 101. But then also like really pulling in this orthopedic piece, right? So yes, I will often still and almost always do a pelvic floor assessment because that, you know, it is worth looking at. But I want to see how that is incorporated with a lot of their other movement.
Mhm.
And what's even going on with like their bracing strategies and their abdominal strategies and what they're able to do with kind of like a, core canister, so to speak, of how all of this is relating to each other and not just the
Yeah.
pelvic floor alone.
Yep.
So, again, like I was telling you, depending on what the person's coming in with, but let's say it's simple postpartum leaking, I'll do that the pelvic floor evaluation. And then again, I will go kind of right to that return to run screen, especially if
Yeah.
running is their biggest goal. I'm going to get them, looking at what their core strength is through planks and bridges and those sort of things. I'm going to look at their single leg strength. And then I'm going to look at what their impact strategies are and what their tolerance is with it. Like I had someone I was doing this with recently. She, I think, was 12 weeks postpartum when we started together. She wasn't necessarily having leakage at the time. She hadn't really gone back to running, but she was nervous that she was going to. And she also just felt kind of weak, and she wanted to kind of work on it and feel stronger, feel better, and get back to running. And she was also having some bowel or fecal smearing after bowel movements. And so that's kind of what led her to pelvic PT. But anyways, so we looked at her pelvic floor, a little bit of coordination issues going on. And so I thought, okay, what's really happening with more activity for her? And so we went kind of right to that return to run screen, and we were looking at impact, and she was so nervous to let her feet leave the ground. I mean,
Yes.
she was, barely inching away from the ground. She was so nervous. And right before we did it, wait, can I go to the bathroom? And so it's just like picking up on those things. I wasn't like pointing those out to her as like super red flags, but just in my mind thinking like, okay, she's nervous to let her feet come off the ground. We've got to build up that confidence with her ability to jump, right? Not only on 2 feet, but also on one. And then her hip strength definitely needed a huge amount of work. And so, the next few sessions that we worked together, lots of focus on her single leg hip strength and balance. Not complicated stuff, but just getting her back moving again. And integrating some of the pelvic floor coordination. I don't necessarily cue her to do Kegels specifically. I just have her use a good bracing and breathing strategy with those exercises that helps her feel nice and supported. We've looked specifically, I think, with her pelvic floor, maybe 3 out of the 5 or 6 sessions we've had together already. So it's not like we're doing that all the time. We started lying down, we got her standing up and looking at it differently from different perspectives. So again, that's where that mashup really has started to work well together. And so sometimes we don't really even spend time on the mat. We go right into the gym, and we go right into activity and strength building and impact and endurance and driving power from the hips. And it's beautiful. I love it.
Well, she probably does too, because you're actually looking at what she's there for. Yeah. I remember back, I don't know how many years ago this was, but like when we were just, okay, you're here for pelvic floor, and they wouldn't get up off the table. And then you have problems with them coming back and continuity and buy-in. And I'm like, well, of course, because you haven't actually ever looked at what they were doing. I mean, I think it was probably, I had like a really short version. I think it came from like Blaze Williams or something like that, of a return to run readiness screen that I kind of pulled together from just like a return to run for just general injury things before the UK guidelines came out. And it was the dumbest thing ever that we're trying to return women to running and not even assessing impact. Like we're not even asking you to jump and see what you're like. You haven't jumped in 20 months. Why in God's name do you think that you're going to be able to just go right back to it?
Right. Totally. Yeah. And a lot of them, they go back to it and you're like, God, this feels so weird, And
it
it's
does.
like, yeah, running. What do you think your body's going to do?
Right. Well, and it's interesting to me too, from an orthopedic perspective. I had a client recently that I was evaluating her for stress incontinence with impact. And she was also being seen for knee issues. And they're like, oh, go try and run. And the running progression that she was going back to, it was too much. And she hurt her knee. And we went back, and so I saw her and did the run readiness screen. I'm like, I wouldn't have cleared you to do this.
Yeah.
So even just, and I think this is something that we can kind of spread across the board as well, is like, are we truly screening people for appropriateness and readiness to run across the board? Like, yes, postpartum, great. That's a
Right.
really important time. But, even women that are going back 3 years postpartum, 5 years, 7 years,
Mhm.
we still should be screening them, even if it's a knee issue or something like that, because
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but the more I start looking at the ankle and the foot and like how little these women clear the floor,
Right.
if
Right.
you're not getting any sort of impact management there, guess who's left holding the ball?
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
pelvic floor gets all the blame. It's like, really, it
Right.
may not even be that bad. It's your ankle's fault.
Yes. Yes. I think that was one of the biggest things too that I took away from your course is like there's so much more that goes into
Yes.
running than just, the pelvic floor when we're talking about pelvic floor symptoms. And
Yep.
I have found calf strength to be one of the biggest things that
So
is affected.
important.
Yeah.
And you know what, where we pulled all that stuff from was all return to run after like Achilles
Yeah.
tendinopathy, tendon
PCL
tears,
recovery. Yeah.
things like that. Like, because you're going to have to train for ACL, even, prep for impact. I'm like, okay, great. We're just going to take this research and bastardize it because nobody's throwing money at, postpartum things. But
Right.
the other thing that I have found, and I think this has probably evolved since you took pro, was with telehealth. I found that I had to organize my evaluation differently. I don't know if you realize this
Mhm.
too. Like when you have somebody in front of you, you can be doing, a physical exam, but kind of be thinking in the back of your head, okay, what's going on here? And telehealth, you can't because you're talking.
Right.
Silence is really awkward.
Yeah.
And so what I realized I had started to do was I said, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to think out loud here. I'm seeing X, Y, and Z. And I feel like this is because of this, and this is because of this, and this, I'm not sure. And as I started to explain my thought process and how I was trying to problem solve through and kind of make a thread, they started adding missing pieces of information like, hey, this might not
Mhm.
matter, but oh, by the way, I had all these ankle sprains, when I ran track, and then you kind of create this collaboration because they're invested. They're
Yeah.
like, okay, I see where you're going with this, and oh wait, I've got a piece of information that might help with that. And then
Yeah.
honestly, I was afraid to do that before, and working with students and mentees, we would always ask them to step outside the room so they could kind of get their thoughts together.
Right.
And I'm like, you know what? Screw this. I'm going to throw my head out there. You're going to think I'm crazy, but this is kind of what I'm thinking. So I'm sure that there's some of that's like, I'm old and I don't care anymore. But with that, like, honestly, it's pulled in a different aspect
Yeah.
of the subjective.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. And it gets them involved, rather
Yes.
than just having them rely on you or
Yep.
feel like you're gonna fix them. Um, it's
Yeah.
it's a huge, huge difference.
And it's
And
so much more fun,
it is. It really
isn't it?
is. Yeah.
Because then,
It's
like, when they're
great.
like, "Hey, guess what?" And then they tell you what they did, you're just like, it's like
Ah,
your kid did something. You're
the
like, "I'm so
best feeling in
proud
the
of you."
world. Yes.
Right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think another thing that's been great is just like feeling okay that I don't have to give someone 10 million
Oh,
exercises to
bless you.
do, like
Amen to
I
that.
was starting to do that a little bit before I saw you took your course, but definitely has been much more of my practice since taking the course is like, you know what? If you're the kind of person that wants a lot of exercises, great.
Right.
I will
Yeah.
absolutely give that to you.
Yep.
Most people don't, especially moms. And so let's find a way to give you 2, 3, maybe 4, depending on how you're feeling with some exercises that you do a couple times a week. If you're doing more, great. But you know what? That still works. And I've found such great success with that. Not only people getting better,
Yeah.
but people feeling like they can do it and it's accomplishable. And they feel, they come back to me. They tell me they're noticing these differences. They're able to
Yep.
make the changes. They feel it in their bodies. And it just, it feels so good.
It makes it, you get buy-in. I mean, that came from mom, the school of mom. That didn't come from
Yeah,
anything. Well, I paid for that in a different way. Let's put it that way. But
sure. Yeah.
no, that I think that the thing that comes up when I think about that is how many times have you had a client come in and apologize because they're like, well, I wasn't able to get to my exercises, or they cancel their appointment
Yep.
because, well, I couldn't get to anything. And you know what my
Mhm.
response always is? I'm like, I need you to come anyway, because part of my job is to help you figure out how we fit this in. Part of my job is to help prioritize. If something is not working, that's not your fault. That's on me to help you figure this piece out, not to guilt you. And again, having done the mom thing for 11 plus years now, I don't need another guilt trip. I give myself enough. And so again, that one, I don't think moms expect that. I think they're like, oh, well, I'm not doing my thing. I'm a bad patient. I guess this sucks. And then the narrative continues. I'm going to be like this the rest of my life. It's never, you know what, you need to give me something that's going to work in my life. And I think we're expected, is maybe it's a women thing too. If I don't do what I'm told, then too bad. Too bad. And I think our profession needs to do a little bit better job.
Agreed.
Like, can we kill the CVS receipt?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite things that I've been doing with people is just asking them, like, what would work for you? You know, where do you feel like it can fit in? What can fit in? You know, and it's like, again, involving that active participation. They're bought in. They feel like it's like meant for them. And it works for them. And it's just like, bang, got it, done, you know?
Inevitably, though, you know, the one question I always get after we get through it, we're like, okay, we've got this tight, we've got strategies, like this is the best program I've ever made. Inevitably, the next question is, do I have to do Kegels? Should I do Kegels? And I'm like, oh my God, we literally just had this conversation about how we're going to integrate this, and this is beautiful. And
I know. Yeah. And then I think to myself, I'm like, okay, what did I not explain the right way? That you still asking that question.
I have proactively started to be like, okay, so about now you're going to ask me, because I would just get so down. I'm like, what? I did the same thing as you. I'm like, how did I not explain this well?
Yes.
And now I think what you're going to ask me now before I'll do that. And then I'll be like, all right, so what questions haven't I answered for you? And then give them that space. And inevitably the Kegel still comes up.
It is what it is. It's so ingrained.
I know. I'm like, Dr. Kegel, you screwed us.
I'm kidding. Oh my God. Now there's
far too long.
There. Yeah.
Far too long. Awesome. Well, if you want to follow Courtney's on Instagram at pelvic_edge. If you want to find her, what's your website so people can find you?
Yes, our website is redgept.com. So regenerative edge, redgept.com.
Awesome. And you're in Connecticut and do telehealth in Connecticut as well, which is fantastic. I'm so happy that that's still going, even though
it's great.
I think, you know, the more that we can find avenues to meet moms where they are, the more women are going to get care. So just keep it up. Awesome. And thank you so much for coming on and kind of sharing your experience with Pro. It's, you know, those of you that have gone through it, you're near and dear to my heart, but it just feels so good to know that you're changing how you practice and the women that are impacted from that. Hopefully that just keeps going on and on and on. So thank you for that.
Well,
awesome.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, because that's how we learn, it's how we improve. And it's really been amazing. So
awesome. We'll just keep paying it forward.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Courtney.
All right.